Alexander the Great had taken Macedonia from a kingdom in northern Greece to the foremost power in human history. His empire spanned from modern-day Albania to Pakistan. He had crushed the quarrelsome Greek city-states to his south and destroyed the Persian Empire that had plagued his people for 200 years. On 323 BC, Alexander, the greatest man in human history, died in Babylon at the age of 32. He refused to name an heir and instead said his empire would go to the strongest. His cause of death was unknown. Some say he was poisoned, others that Aristotle played a part in his assassination. Potentially it was alcohol poisoning, but the likely outcome was a simple typhoid fever. After Alexander's death, his empire was devoured by his supposedly loyal generals. There was Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, the Antigonid Empire, the Kingdom of Lysimachus, Cassander's Macedonia, Pergamon, and Bactria. None of them stuck to his succession plan, and Cassander had Alexander's son, Alexander IV, poisoned to keep his own power. The remaining generals, known as the Diadochi, would begin a series of wars that lasted from 322 to 275 BC. These wars greatly weakened each other, and they would fall in the following years. Ptolemaic Egypt would be the last successor to Alexander before it fell to Rome in 30 BC. In order to change this, we need to go back to Alexander's childhood. Alexander was raised alongside most of his generals under the tutelage of Aristotle. Alexander would pay far more attention to Aristotle as a child. Most importantly, he and his companions would adopt the proper Hellenic tradition of watering down your wine. This would be very important, as it would prevent them from all becoming raging alcoholics, and Alexander would never have had the mental deterioration that worried his companions. His mental fortitude would stop the conspiracy on his life that occurred while he was campaigning in Persia, as there never would have been any drunken arguments between him and his best generals. The conspiracy was where Philotas and Parmenion, two of his best generals, were killed for failing to detect the plot on his life. Alexander would have never burned down Persepolis in a drunken rage, and he would not kill Cletus the Black. Cletus had saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus and was a highly respected general. The last change would be Hephaestion. In real life, he was recovering from a fever when he drank tons of wine and quickly died, but now he would recover from the fever. Besides these things, his campaigns would have been identical to the real ones. Alexander would have conquered the same amount of land, and in 332 he would have returned to Babylon with the known world at his fingertips. It is largely speculative on what would have happened, but my best guess is to follow Craterus' plans. According to Diodorus Siculus, Alexander told Craterus his plans before he died. It was proposed to build 1,000 warships, larger than triremes, in Phoenicia, Syria, Cilicia, and Cyprus for the campaign against the Carthaginians and the others who live along the coast of Libya and Iberia, in the adjoining coastal region as far as Sicily, to make a road along the coast of Libya as far as the Pillars of Heracles, and, as needed by so great an expedition, to construct ports and shipyards in suitable places. To erect 6 most costly temples, each at an expense of 1,500 talents, roughly $3 billion today, and finally, to establish cities and transplant populations from Asia to Europe and in the opposite direction from Europe to Asia, in order to bring the largest continents to common unity and friendship by means of intermarriages and family ties. The temples mentioned above were to be built at Delos, Delphi, and Dodona, and in Macedonia, a temple to Zeus at Dium, to Artemis Tauropolis at Amphipolis, and to Athena at Cernus. Likewise, at Ilium, Troy, in honor of this goddess, there was to be built a temple that could never be surpassed by any other. A tomb of his father Philip was to be constructed to match the greatest of the pyramids of Egypt, buildings which some persons count among the 7 greatest works of man. It must be noted that the accuracy of these claims is dubious, and contemporary historians doubted their legitimacy. Despite this, I'll follow these as best I can, because it is the best guide I have. In the fall of 332, Alexander would commission his subjects to build the largest fleet the world had ever seen. He then used his new Persian army, which Plutarch had mentioned. The 30,000 boys whom he had left behind him under instruction and training were now so vigorous in their bodies and so comely in their looks, and showed besides such an admirable dexterity and agility in their exercises, that Alexander himself was delighted, with whom he could go on and conquer the world. This new force was the culmination of thousands of years of Middle Eastern warfare, and they would see Alexander's dreams achieved. He also began 200,000 new Persian youth to train in the Macedonian ways, and set up a system throughout his empire to ensure new boys were being trained to supply his armies. He marched from Babylon to his capital of Pella, where he received a god's welcome and was deified by many of the Greeks there. Alexander built Pella up to rival Babylon in size and splendor, and it would be firmly cemented as the capital of the empire, which placated many Greeks who were worried that Alexander's empire was becoming too Persian. At the center of the city was the new tomb of Philip. I have no idea what the Greek equivalent of a pyramid was, but Alexander's chief architect was a bit of a mad genius, so it would have been spectacular. In 331, he marched into Dacia with a force of about 50,000 men and conquered his way up to the Tiris River in Dacia and across the Carpathian Mountains. He then received word from the Greek cities in Scythia that they were being attacked and constantly raided, so Alexander marched into Scythia in 329. He fought a massive Scythian horde in August of 329, and by the end of 328, he had annexed all of the Greek cities in the area. While that had been going on, Antipater led an invasion of Illyria to further fortify the borders, and by 328, he pushed all the way to the Alps. 326, navy was completed and brought to Greece, so the Macedonian invasion of the Mediterranean began. Within the year, the Greek colonies on Italy had submitted to him. Some out of fear, others were glad, however, to join his Greek empire. By 325, he marched into Sicily and began to siege Syracuse. After a 2-month siege, the city fell and became his base of operations. Alexander spent the next 2 years and conquered the entire island. Philotas and Perdiccas took a portion of the army and sailed to Corsica, while Alexander sailed to Sardinia. By 322, the two islands were subjugated, and in 321, Alexander led his navy south, where he met Carthage's navy under Hamilcar II. The Macedonians demolished Carthage, and the pathway to the west was opened up. 80,000 Carthaginians were killed. Alexander then landed in North Africa, where he captured various smaller Greek cities before he captured Utica in November. He wintered there before moving on to Carthage the following spring. Carthage fell by August of 320. He then set his sights on the rest of Carthage and conquered the land up to the Atlantic, while Ptolemy marched east, connecting his lands to Egypt. They both built new cities, and another massive city, Alexandria Ducis, was built at the Pillars of Heracles. He then crossed the Pillars of Heracles into Iberia, where he captured various Carthaginian cities until he reached Carthago Nova in 317. He sent Seleucus and Craterus to conquer the rest of the peninsula while the siege continued. After a 14th-month siege, the city fell, and the rest of Iberia was firmly under his command by 315. The Gymnasian Islands also swore allegiance to Macedonia. The Greek cities in Gaul submitted to him and gave him a hero's welcome before he wintered in Massalia in 314. There he learned of the journeys of Euthymenes, who sailed down Africa, and Pythias, who sailed to Scandia. He received reinforcements from Persia during the winter. He began his final push of the Mediterranean in 313 when he marched into Etruscan lands. He demanded they submit to his rule, some agreed while others refused, and by 311 he conquered them all. Eumenes had marched up from the south and conquered the Samnites, the Messapians, and the Apulians. Alexander's last major battle in Europe took place on July 21, 310, where his armies faced off against Rome, 170 years after the Battle of Thermopylae. A combined army of Greeks and Persians were fighting to control the entire world. The Romans were vastly outnumbered and inexperienced compared to their Macedonian counterparts, and the battle reflected that. Alexander's phalanx crushed the proto-legionaries of Rome and secured the entire Mediterranean from Macedonia. He returned to Pella by the end of the year and took over command from Hephaestion, who had ruled in his stead. Many of the projects were completed at this point. Philip's tomb was completed, and the city was truly the center of the world. At this point, the empire was extremely large and full of many different cultures, over 100. So Alexander's most ambitious task began, hybridizing the cultures into one. The future of his empire hung in the balance of these next 4 years. He moved around 20 million people throughout his empire to create a new culture that the world had never seen. The many polytheistic religions were amalgamated into one, and he took people who had nothing in common and gave them an option to build a new life. The project saw mostly poor and middle-class people move, and his empire resembled America in some regards. He offered the lower classes jobs and a chance to move up the ladder if they moved to various different sections and satraps of the empire. They worked on his massive projects, such as connecting the cities of his empire. Roads were built all throughout the empire, greatly connecting it. For example, some were built from Iberia all the way to Sogdia, and his empire would become more unified. He built new schools and temples, Macedonian academies of war were built throughout the empire, which only increases army sizes. Over 500,000 boys joined the academies to fight. Almost all of the cities had various different populations of Greeks, Persians, Iranians, Iberians, Italians, Egyptians, Scythians, Carthaginians, Indians, etc. All of this made it almost impossible to rebel, as the people were far too divided and relied on the government for much of their lives, in the short term at least, until they were acclimated. While it seems unlikely that this could occur, it's far more feasible than you may think. In the real world, Persia had maintained control over 30 or so different cultures and kept them unified for hundreds of years. Alexander's eastern successor, the Seleucid Empire, maintained a fusion culture between Greece and the east for about 250 years with far worse leadership. So in this timeline, the massive demographic unification would have been far smoother, as the empire was very stable and it would ensure security for the future. Alexander also redrew the satraps to diversify the people even more and sent out his old and retired generals in important areas to govern as their fighting days were over. He sent men to circumnavigate Africa from both the east and west, and he was able to establish a system for a successful successor. He formalized the old school of Aristotle to be the way of law for future kings. Future royalty would be raised together and taught by the brightest students of Aristotle's schools. The upper class would be grouped in units to force them to get along and work cohesively, as an empire of this magnitude needed unity to maintain itself. His son Alexander IV and his companion sons were taught by Theophrastus, Aristotle's most famous philosophy student. They were raised in an identical way to himself, as they were raised together as a unit. Alexander IV would grow up to be an excellent ruler, with great men around him like his father had been. It's impossible to say how long a system like this would have been cohesive and feasible before there would have been bad or unjust rulers, but I think this could have worked at least for a few generations following his death. In 302, his invasion of Arabia began. He conquered Nabatea and had Seleucus and Leonidas push down the African coast, while Cassander and Alexander IV led the eastern frontier. Alexander pushed down the southern tip of Arabia by 300, where he had conquered the Sabbateans and the Quantabanians. In the meantime, Cassander and Alexander IV had conquered the entire eastern coastline, taking out the Caranians and the Mazunians. The Bedouin tribe signed an agreement to become a satrapy, but in reality nothing changed for them, and Macedonia did not care to exert control over them, as the desert gave them no financial benefits, so they did not really care what the tribes did. Seleucus and Leonidas had conquered the Nubian kingdoms and pushed to the coast, where they annexed the Blemmyes, the Viga, and the Damat, before returning north to Egypt. In 299, Alexander met up with Cassander and Alexander IV and subjugated Hadramaut, giving them control over the entire peninsula. Alexander built new cities between Arabia and Nubia, each with its own military academies, and forced population changes to bring them fully into the empire, completing an integration process that lasted many years. His army returned north to Babylon, where he gave Alexander IV control over most satrapies of the former Achaemenid Empire. Alexander began planning his last conquest, an invasion of India. This time he would not be robbed by disrespectful, lazy, mutinous men. He would avenge the failed attack of Dionysus from the Greek myths and push further than any man before. In the meantime, Macedonia fought some minor skirmishes against various Celtic raids on the western front, but the empire's massive army stood tall. By 297, Alexander gathered 250,000 men for war from all corners of the empire, but his trusty silver shield would still be the linchpin of his army. He crossed over the Hephaestus in spring, and the war began. India had just undergone a period of unrest 25 years earlier. According to Malinda Panha, there was a slaughter of 10,000 elephants, 100,000 horses, 5,000 charioteers, and 1 billion foot soldiers. While this is obviously exaggerating, it shows that tons of Indians died. So India was not at full strength. Despite this, the Mauryaans would still be able to draw upon massive armies to fight the Macedonians. Alexander rolled in and crushed the Mauryaans in a series of battles initially, so they recalled Chandragupta to lead them in battle. This, however, was a terrible mistake for the Mauryaans, as he led them to battle at Indraprastha in 296. Alexander IV killed him with a bow during the Macedonian rout over the Indians. Following his death, the people panicked, and Alexander moved from city to city. By Ratval, then Mathura, and he continued on eastward towards their capital. The Macedonians took heavy casualties, but Alexander's military genius made them unbeatable. At the end of 294, he had conquered all the way to Varanasi. The following spring, the Macedonians reached Pataliputra, the Mauryan capital. By the end of the summer, it fell, shattering the Indians. With the seat of power now in enemy hands, various generals claimed to be the emperor, but they had systematically were killed off over the next 3 years in a similar fashion as the late claimants to the Persian throne. Both Alexanders received reinforcements in 289 before they began conquering the divided Dravidian kingdoms of the south. By the end of 284, all of India was under Macedonian control, and Alexander established 6 new satrapies for the subcontinent. He was able to fuse the Indian religion into an imperial one, and sent 6 million Indians to the farthest reaches of his empire, breaking their spirit. He also built new cities and used some existing ones to integrate India. He immediately put over 300,000 Indian boys into his military academies to serve in the army. He wanted to push even further east to Ceres, the ancient Greek word for China, but Alexander IV refused to go further alongside most of the men. He had already stretched as the furthest reaches of the world, and the gods were pleased enough. Eventually, Alexander relented and began the journey back home. On the way back to Macedonia, his army stopped at Bucephala and built it into one of the finest cities of his empire. Bucephala was named after Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, which had served Alexander faithfully for over 20 years on the battlefield. They reached Babylon in 282, and Alexander IV stayed there to govern the east, while Alexander continued on to Pella. At this point, all of his projects were completed, and he began another massive project on Euboea to honor himself. Throughout his life, he had taken Macedonia from a regional power of northern Greece to the largest empire in human history. He built thousands of cities, schools, temples, and roads. He had successfully united people from Iberia to India, and would move on to the next life on June 10th, 273. He would take his place among the gods and had finally outmatched his legendary hero and rival, Achilles, as the greatest of all men. I'm planning on making a part 2 that explores the long-term impacts of these conquests and explores the changes on cultures, religions, languages, and more. Please let me know if you think that is a good idea and any suggestions you have for the future video below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Goodbye.